Today on the Perception and Action podcast, what is the difference between technique and skill? Do we need to learn the former before we can have the latter? So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I want to briefly discuss the topic of technique versus skill. This was inspired by a commentary article published by Bennett and Franson late last year, which builds on similar distinctions made by everyone from Bernstein to Newell. To quote the authors on the purpose of this paper, although decades of research on the distinction between technique and skill and related topics such as coordination and movement control in the movement science precede this article, we notice that a considerable knowledge gap continues to exist between skill acquisition science and how scientific principles obtained from skill acquisition science are used across football science disciplines and football applied practices. End quote. So as this quote suggests, this article is focused on the sport of football or soccer, but it applies equally to all the sports, right? The main point of this article is that this distinction has been made over and over by several authors, as I mentioned, all the way from Bernstein to Newell to Kelso, but it doesn't seem to have hit home when we look at a lot of the practice we see. So in this paper, the authors developed definitions of these two things. Technique refers to a particular specific movement solution or coordination pattern out of the many possible solutions that could be used to solve a problem faced by an athlete. Of course, what we're typically talking about here is the one ideal coordination pattern as defined by a coach. Skill, on the other hand, refers to how an athlete can adapt a technique to produce a behavior that suits the task demands and results in a successful performance outcome, making it both functional and beneficial. Obviously, on the podcast, I've spent a lot of time critiquing the idea of the one ideal movement solution, focusing on issues like differences in intrinsic dynamics and individual constraints, evidence for the beneficial role of movement variability in performance, and how athletes are faced with ever-changing constraints both internally and externally. This concept of skill put forth in this article was captured nicely by Bernstein with his concept of dexterity. Quote, Bernstein recognized that the term dexterity is used primarily with some physical activities and not others. The same holds true for the term skill. For example, in everyday language, one tends not to speak of a skilled walker or the skill of walking. In its adjectival form, skill refers to characterize performance capabilities and qualities in ontologic activities, in which the adaptive component to the skilled performance is presumed to be significant. As a noun, skill implies that the individual is adapted to the changing internal and external demands. That is, the individual adjusts the movement coordination and control solution according to the changing constraints inherent in the action. The timescale of the changing constraints to action can vary considerably from the unpredictable and immediate to the expected and more permanent. Returning to the article, the authors critique the amount of practice time we spend on drilling technique instead of giving athletes opportunities to become skillful. Quote, simply put, we can consider a technique to be but one of the possible movement solutions to a movement problem faced by an athlete. Skill, on the other hand, represents the extent to which an athlete can adapt their technique to produce behavior that suits the task demands, i.e. it's functional, and results in performance optimization, i.e. it is beneficial. It is unlikely that the grooving of a technique through hundreds of thousands of training repetitions alone, as was and perhaps still is the norm in some football practice, ultimately leads to truly skilled performers who can cope with the ever-changing demands of football game play. Coaches and sporting practitioners should consider developing training tasks where the aim is to improve the player's adaptability in terms of techniques they use to achieve a task goal, rather than the consistent performance of the task through a repetitive production of the same idealized coordination pattern. End quote. Okay, time for my 2 cents and my rant. Obviously, I agree 100% with the conclusions of this paper. The practice of spending hours and hours of valuable practice time repetitively drilling the fundamentals has got to end. Following the paper I looked at today, the fundamentals are clearly a technique and the way they're typically coached, repetitively, in an unrepresentative, decoupled manner, with heavily internally focused instructions are all things we know lead to poor transfer of training. If as a coach you believe there are certain invariants, non-negotiables that need to be in the movement solution, i.e. it has to have a particular form or what Kelso called a topology, then there's an ever-growing body of evidence to show that these things are much better taught through constraints than drilling one ideal technique. As evidence, see the study I reviewed in episode 455. This was a soccer study that compared conventional technical drilling with a constraints-led approach to soccer. In their pre- and post-test of the fundamentals of passing and shooting, they found that both groups learned these equally well. So you don't need to drill them for the main forms of these techniques to come out. But there was also an advantage in that the CLA group learned these in far fewer touches of the ball. Letting an athlete develop the basic topology of a movement through constraints in a representative, repetition without repetition practice environment has many, many advantages that have been shown in recent studies. It promotes a greater sense of autonomy and ownership, which we know is important for motivation. It allows for the athlete to better adapt to their own individual constraints and intrinsic dynamics, since we're allowing a lot more room for variability in the solutions. It reduces the wear and tear and workload of practice because we can achieve the same things in far less repetitions. And of course, it gives a much greater opportunity for the athlete to be truly skillful, be able to adapt their solution to changing constraints. Finally, as I have observed myself many times, it allows the athlete to learn the whys of a movement solution themselves. A great example of this point about the whys can be seen in the work of Alex Sarma, host of the new Transforming Basketball podcast, who I guested on recently. Alex has developed some great practice activities for teaching the quote-unquote fundamentals of doing things like a layup. Instead of a player holding their arm up like this and their leg like that because the coach tells them to, they learn the principles and the whys of these different body positions by experiencing making shots from different angles with defenders positioned in different locations. Lastly, I know a big argument for the quote-unquote fundamentals is that we have to give the athlete some feelings of confidence and competence first or they won't show up to practice the next day. Again, these things can be easily achieved following an ecological approach and using constraints. See my episode on motivation in episode 433. So returning to the paper, stop focusing so much on technique and hoping that the athlete can become skillful later. You're looking at it completely in the wrong order. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including a monthly coaches meetup, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.